My name is Lashonda Esposito, and my brother once told his country club friends that I watched kids for pocket money. This was 6 hours after I'd authorized the deployment of an entire carrier strike group to the Persian Gulf. The thing about being a rear admiral in the U.S. Navy is that most civilians have no concept of what that means. They hear Navy and picture enlisted sailors swabbing decks. My family certainly did. I'd been in the Navy for 23 years, starting as an ensign fresh out of Annapolis, working my way through surface warfare operations, command at sea, and eventually into flag officer ranks that came with responsibilities most people couldn't fathom. By 41, I was a 2-star admiral commanding fleet operations across the Atlantic, with authority over 30,000 personnel and assets worth billions. My brother Nathan knew I was in the Navy the way someone might know their neighbor works in IT. Vague, unimpressive, nothing worth discussing at dinner parties. I'd stopped trying to explain years ago. It started innocuously enough. I was 28, a lieutenant commander fresh off my first department head tour, home for Christmas. Nathan had just made partner at his father-in-law's investment firm, a genuine achievement that he mentioned approximately every 6 minutes. "So you're still on that ship?" he'd asked over eggnog, his tone suggesting I worked on a fishing trawler. "Destroyer," I'd corrected. "I'm the combat systems officer." Right, he'd nodded without really listening. "But what's the end game here? I mean, you can't do this forever. What's the private sector equivalent?" I'd been managing weapons systems worth $300 million and coordinating with air defense networks across 3 time zones. The private sector equivalent didn't exist. "I'm pretty happy where I am," I'd said. He'd patted my shoulder with the kind of sympathy reserved for people who'd given up on ambition. "Well, job security is important too. Nothing wrong with that." Job security, as if the Navy was a fallback plan for people who couldn't hack it in the real world. That became the template. Every promotion took me deeper into operational command, further from any explanation that would make sense to civilians. When I made captain at 35, commanding my own guided missile cruiser, my mother's main concern was whether the long deployments would hurt my chances of settling down. "You're not getting any younger, honey," she'd said, "and men want women who are available, present." I'd been in the Arabian Sea, managing counter-piracy operations and serving as the strike group's air defense commander, but sure, not available enough. When I pinned on my first star at 38, becoming one of the youngest female admirals in the Navy, I'd flown home for a brief visit between assignments. Nathan was hosting a barbecue, his new house in Bethesda, the one with the pool in the 3-car garage. "Lashonda's here," he'd announced to his guests. My sister, the career military woman, still single, still sailing around the world, living her best life. The guests had smiled politely. One woman, a lawyer married to a surgeon, had asked what I did exactly. "I'm in fleet operations," I'd said. "Oh, like logistics?" "Something like that," Nathan had jumped in. "Lashonda's basically middle management. You know how the military is. Lots of hierarchy, lots of bureaucracy. But hey, the benefits are great, right?" I'd commanded a destroyer squadron. I'd been responsible for 4 ships and 1,200 personnel. I'd coordinated with foreign navies and made tactical decisions in real-time crisis situations. The benefits are solid, I'd agreed. The fiction solidified. I became Lashonda, who does something with boats, in their narrative. They weren't trying to be cruel. They genuinely couldn't conceive of a reality where their sister and daughter held more authority than anyone they knew personally. It was easier to let them believe it. The delusions manifested in small, constant ways. My mother would call while I was in classified briefings, leaving voicemails about setting me up with divorced lawyers or accountants who had their lives together. "You need someone stable, honey, someone established. You've done your military phase. It's time to think about your future." My future involved command of fleet forces that projected American power across 2 oceans. But who was counting? Nathan's obsession with status grew with his success. Every promotion, every new client, every upgrade to his lifestyle came with a subtle reminder that he'd made it while I'd chosen public service over real achievement. At my father's retirement party 3 years ago, Nathan had given a toast about family success. "Dad taught us to work hard," he'd said, "and we all did, in our own ways. I'm proud of what I've built, and I'm proud of LaShonda too, even though she chose a different path. Not everyone needs the corner office and the big salary. Some people find meaning in service." The guests had nodded appreciatively. How noble, how selfless. I'd been making $180,000 a year, comfortable but not extravagant. Nathan made triple that. In his mind, that settled the question of who'd succeeded. What he didn't know was that I'd briefed the president. Twice. I'd sat in the Situation Room during international crises. I'd commanded forces during real-world operations that made the news without anyone knowing I was there. But I didn't need him to know. The work mattered, the recognition didn't. Then came the phone call about the charity auction. Nathan had gotten involved with a children's hospital charity. Good work, genuinely. He'd helped organize a fundraising auction that would draw the area's wealthy and powerful. Senators, corporate executives, old money families. The kind of event where appearances mattered more than the cause. "You should come," he'd said. "It'll be good for you. Networking, you know. Maybe meet some people. You never know what opportunities might come up." "I'll try to make it," I'd said. "And LaShonda, wear something nice, not your uniform, something that makes you look successful." I'd been at the Pentagon that day, coordinating with the Joint Chiefs on force readiness assessments. But sure, something that looked successful. The night of the auction, I wore a simple black dress and pearl earrings. Classic, understated, appropriate. I looked like someone who belonged without drawing attention, a skill honed over decades of navigating male-dominated spaces. The venue was the Renwick Ballroom, a historic space in Georgetown with soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers. 200 guests in designer clothes, drinking expensive wine, bidding on vacation packages and artwork, while occasionally remembering they were here for sick children. Nathan found me near the silent auction tables, his face flushed with wine and self-importance. "LaShonda, you made it!" He hugged me, then stepped back to look me over. "You look great, very professional." "Thanks, this is quite the turnout." "Isn't it? We've raised almost $200,000 already. And the live auction hasn't even started." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Senator Morrison is here, and the Caldwell family, you know, the real estate, Caldwells. This is the A-list." "Impressive," I said. "Come on, I want to introduce you around. Good for you to see how these things work." He steered me toward a cluster of donors. Men in expensive suits, women dripping with jewelry that cost more than most people's cars. Nathan's hand on my elbow felt proprietary, like he was presenting a curiosity. "Everyone, I want you to meet my sister LaShonda." Polite smiles, curious glances. "LaShonda does? Well, what do you do exactly?" Nathan laughed. "I can never quite explain it." "I'm in the Navy," I said simply. "Right, but specifically?" A woman in a red dress leaned forward. "My nephew is in the Navy. He's an engineer on a submarine. I'm in fleet operations." Nathan jumped in before I could elaborate. "She's basically in administration, manages schedules, coordinates, stuff, you know, keeping the gears turning." The group nodded. Unimpressive, but respectable. Someone had to do the boring work. A man in a tuxedo, introduced as the CEO of a medical device company, asked, "Is that fulfilling? I imagine it's quite routine." "It has its moments," I said. Nathan squeezed my shoulder. "LaShonda's always been content with simplicity. Not everyone needs the stress of real leadership, you know?" Real leadership. I'd commanded at sea, in combat zones. I'd made decisions that determined whether people lived or died. I'd been promoted ahead of 95% of my peers. But sure, no real leadership. The conversation moved on. Someone asked Nathan about his portfolio performance. Another person discussed their vacation home in Tuscany. I stood at the edge of the circle, holding my wine, thinking about the carrier strike group currently under my operational control in the Mediterranean. The live auction began. Nathan took the stage as master of ceremonies, his voice booming through the sound system as he worked the crowd like a pro. Art pieces, jewelry, exclusive experiences, all going for absurd amounts to people who could barely feel the dent in their bank accounts. Between auction items, Nathan told stories. Charming anecdotes about the hospital, about the children being helped, and then, inevitably, about himself. "You know, I was thinking about success tonight," he said, his voice taking on a philosophical tone, "about what we measure and what matters. And I'm reminded that my own family shows the full spectrum." My stomach tightened. "My sister is here tonight," he continued, gesturing toward me. The spotlight swung over, catching me in its glare. 200 faces turned. "LaShonda! Wave hello!" I raised my hand slightly, my face neutral. LaShonda babysits rich people's kids, still making $15 an hour at 35. Nathan said it with a laugh, like it was a charming quirk. Different definitions of success, right? The room erupted in laughter, not mean-spirited exactly, but pitying. The kind of laughter that comes from relief that you're not the punchline. "I mean it," Nathan continued, warming to his subject. "Not everyone needs the six-figure salary in the corner office. LaShonda's happy with her simple life, and there's something beautiful about that. She does her military thing, watches some kids on the side for extra cash, lives modestly. It's actually kind of inspiring, choosing contentment over ambition." More laughter. Someone near the front raised their glass in mock salute. A woman at a nearby table gasped audibly, "How do you survive? Isn't $15 below minimum wage in some places?" Nathan shrugged, smiling. "She manages. And honestly, the freedom of not having real responsibility, I envy that sometimes." The spotlight moved away. Nathan launched into the next auction item. The crowd's attention shifted, but the damage was done. Around me, people whispered, glanced over with expressions mixing pity and curiosity. I stood perfectly still, my wine glass steady in my hand despite the rushing in my ears. Babysitting. $15 an hour. Simple life. I'd spent the morning in a secure video conference with the Fleet Forces commander and representatives from NATO-allied navies. I'd reviewed operational plans involving the coordination of surface action groups across the Atlantic. I had 17 captains reporting to me. My command was responsible for maintaining maritime security and projecting power across millions of square miles of ocean. But I babysat for $15 an hour. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so absurd. I considered leaving, just walking out, getting in my car, driving back to reality. But something kept me rooted. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the grim fascination of watching how far the fiction could stretch before reality snapped it. The auction continued. Someone paid $30,000 for a weekend at a Napa Valley vineyard. Someone else paid $25,000 for a sculpture that looked like twisted metal. I moved toward the back of the ballroom, away from the spotlight, away from the whispers. Found a small table near the terrace doors where I could watch without being watched. Quite the show. I turned. A man in his 60s stood beside me. Silver hair, distinguished bearing, wearing his expensive suit with the casualness of someone born to it. There was something familiar about him, but I couldn't place it. "Indeed," I said, "your brother is very enthusiastic. That's one word for it." He smiled. "Senator William Morrison. I don't believe we've been introduced." Senator Morrison. I knew that name, not socially, but professionally. He sat on the Senate Armed Services Committee. I'd briefed his staff twice, though we'd never met directly. "LaShonda Esposito," I said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, his eyes sharp. "Esposito, that name is familiar." "I doubt it." No, I know that name." He paused, thinking. Then his eyes widened slightly. "Wait, Admiral Esposito? From Fleet Forces?" My stomach dropped. The universe had decided to play a joke on me, apparently. Of all the people at this auction, I'd ended up talking to one of the few civilians who might actually recognize my name. "Yes," I said quietly. His expression shifted entirely, from polite interest to something approaching shock. "Admiral." "I didn't. The way your brother was talking, I assumed." He stopped himself, professional instincts kicking in. "I apologize. That was inappropriate." "It's fine." "It most certainly is not." He glanced toward the stage where Nathan was still working the crowd. "Does he know that I'm an admiral? He knows I'm in the Navy. The details have always been vague." Vague, Morrison repeated, a note of disbelief in his voice. You command fleet operations, you brief the Joint Chiefs. That's not vague, that's classified. Exactly. He shook his head slowly. Remarkable. And he thinks you babysit? Apparently. How long have you let this go on? Years. It was easier than explaining. And frankly, my family's opinion of my career doesn't affect my ability to do the job. Morrison looked at me with something between admiration and concern. Admiral, with respect, that's a very generous perspective on what amounts to extraordinary disrespect. It's not malicious, they genuinely don't understand. Understanding requires listening. From what I just witnessed, your brother is too busy talking to listen to anyone. I couldn't argue with that. Morrison checked his watch. I need to make remarks in 15 minutes, but Admiral, if you'll permit me, I think your family needs some understanding of their own. Senator, that's not necessary. Perhaps not necessary, but deserved, he smiled slightly. Consider it a public service. Before I could protest further, he'd walked away, moving toward the front of the ballroom where Nathan was wrapping up the current auction item. I watched with growing dread as Morrison approached the stage, spoke briefly to Nathan, then took the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just a moment, Morrison said, his senator's voice filling the space effortlessly. I know we're here for the Children's Hospital, and we'll get back to that shortly, but I feel compelled to address something. The room quieted. Nathan stood beside him, looking confused, but pleased to be sharing the stage with a senator. Morrison's expression was serious. Earlier this evening, our host made some comments about his sister, jokes about her career, her income, her choices. He paused, letting the words hang. I laughed along with everyone else, but I need to correct the record. My heart was pounding now. Nathan's smile faltered. He leaned toward the microphone. Senator, I was just... Morrison held up a hand. I've had the privilege of serving on the Senate Armed Services Committee for 12 years. In that role, I've met many of our nation's military leaders, commanders who make decisions that affect thousands of lives, officers who carry responsibilities most of us cannot imagine. He turned, scanning the crowd until his eyes found me at the back of the ballroom. Admiral, glad to see you. The ballroom fell silent. Complete, absolute silence. 200 people frozen, trying to process what they'd just heard. Admiral. Nathan's face went white. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Morrison continued, his voice measured and clear. Rear Admiral LaShonda Esposito commands fleet operations for the Atlantic. She holds authority over carrier strike groups and surface action groups. She coordinates with NATO allies and manages crisis response across multiple theaters. She briefs the Joint Chiefs of Staff and, on occasion, the President himself. Someone near the front dropped their wine glass. The sound of it shattering on the marble floor echoed through the silence. She does not babysit, Morrison said quietly. She commands. He handed the microphone back to Nathan, who stood frozen on stage, the color drained from his face. Morrison walked down from the stage, the crowd parting automatically as he moved toward me. When he reached my table, he extended his hand again. Admiral, my apologies for the public nature of that, but some things shouldn't go unchallenged. I shook his hand, my own voice steady despite the chaos of emotions underneath. Thank you, Senator. He nodded and moved away, leaving me standing alone as 200 pairs of eyes turned in my direction. The silence stretched, painful, absolute. Nathan remained on stage, microphone in hand, looking like he might be sick. The woman who'd gasped about $15 an hour had both hands pressed to her mouth. The CEO, who'd asked if my work was fulfilling, looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. My mother stood near the silent auction tables, her face a mask of shock and dawning horror. She'd spent years pitying me, worrying about me, trying to fix my life. The red dress woman who'd mentioned her submarine engineer nephew was frantically whispering to her husband, probably Googling Rear Admiral on her phone to understand exactly how catastrophic the misunderstanding had been. Nathan finally found his voice. LaShonda, I didn't. Why didn't you say? I met his eyes across the ballroom. You never asked. Someone started clapping. Slow, deliberate applause from the back corner. Others joined, and within seconds the entire ballroom was applauding, the sound building like a wave. I stood there, accepting it, though the recognition felt hollow. They were applauding what Morrison had told them, not anything about me they'd bothered to learn themselves. The evening dissolved after that. The auction continued half-heartedly, but the energy had evaporated. People clustered in groups, whispering, processing. Several approached me to apologize, to thank me for my service, to express their shock at the misunderstanding. I accepted their words with grace I didn't entirely feel. Nathan found me as I was preparing to leave. He looked shattered. All his earlier confidence evaporated. "LaShonda, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. All these years I thought you were just what?" I asked quietly. "I don't know. Not this. Never this." He ran a hand through his hair. "An Admiral! Jesus, how did I not know?" "I told you I was in the Navy. The rest was always there if you'd wanted to know. But you never corrected me, never said." "Would you have believed me?" I met his eyes. "If I'd told you I was an Admiral, would you have believed it? Or would you have thought I was exaggerating, pretending to be more important than I was?" He couldn't answer. The truth was written on his face. "You needed me to be less than you," I said, "to prove your choices were the right ones. It was easier to believe I'd failed than to acknowledge I'd succeeded in ways you didn't understand. That's not. I never meant." "I know. That's what makes it sad." I walked past him, through the ballroom, past the staring guests and the whispering groups. My mother tried to intercept me near the door, but I shook my head gently. "Not tonight, Mom." Outside, the night air was cool and clear. I stood on the steps of the Renwick Ballroom, looking up at the stars, barely visible through the light pollution of the city. My phone buzzed. A message from the Fleet Forces Command Duty Officer. "Situation developing in the Black Sea. Request your assessment by 0800 tomorrow." Reality calling. The real world where my decisions mattered. Where my rank meant something beyond embarrassment at a charity auction. I got in my car and drove back toward Pentagon City, toward my apartment and my uniform, and the work that defined me more than any family gathering ever could. The revelation hadn't felt triumphant. Morrison's defense, while appreciated, hadn't undone years of casual dismissal. The applause had been hollow. Recognition after humiliation wasn't really recognition at all. But driving through the quiet streets, I realized something had shifted. Not in how they saw me, that didn't matter anymore, but in how I saw myself in relation to them. I'd spent years letting them believe their fiction because I thought it was generous, thought it was humble, thought it kept me grounded. But generosity had become complicity in my own diminishment. The truth was, I didn't need their understanding to validate my worth. The work spoke for itself. The responsibility spoke for itself. The sailors who served under my command knew who I was. The Allied commanders I worked with knew who I was. The people who mattered knew. My family's ignorance had been willful, comfortable, self-serving, and I'd enabled it by staying silent. Not anymore. Tomorrow I'd brief the situation in the Black Sea, make decisions about force posture and readiness, coordinate with commanders across time zones, do the work that actually mattered. And if Nathan called, if my mother called, if anyone from that ballroom wanted to suddenly know me now that my rank had been revealed, well, I'd decide then whether they'd earned that knowledge. The stars disappeared behind buildings as I drove deeper into the city, but I knew they were still there, just like the truth had always been there, waiting to be seen by anyone who cared enough to look.